Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And I want to thank Dr. Mahmoudi for that really fantastic introduction, and congratulate you and your colleagues for all the work that you have done in this sphere. I would say that for NIH, where this really got started was back in 2018. This was a time that you may recall there was a great deal of societal interest in sexual harassment in particular. And our director at the time, Francis Collins, was quite concerned that as an agency, we really were not doing enough to address this. So at that time, he convened a working group of his advisory committee. So the NIH director has an advisory committee. It's referred to as the advisory committee to the director. It's an official government committee that has various official roles. And this advisory committee then put together a working group that was responsible for evaluating this question. Is it possible to change the culture to end sexual harassment? Again, here, the focus on this was on sexual harassment, but as I will get to, the themes are very much the same for all kinds of harassment and behaviors that lead to an unfavorable working environment. So this report came out in December of 2019. The working group was in play for I think a year, maybe even a little bit over a year, and they produced this outstanding report that talked about four themes. The first, which I think in the introduction we heard a bit about, was transparency and accountability in the reporting of professional misconduct, especially or including sexual harassment, as well as some others, including mechanisms for restorative justice, safe, diverse, and inclusive environments, and system-wide change. Now, our office, I work in the office of the director, and our office is called the Office of Extramural Research. We have a large number of responsibilities, but one of them includes grant oversight and compliance. So that's December of 2019. About 7 months later, in June of 2020, Francis Collins, Kerry Wallenetz, Francis Collins, and I posted an editorial in Science entitled Combating Sexual Harassment, in which we said that the National Institutes of Health has a responsibility to put an end to this behavior. And so at that time, we were still trying to figure out what more we could do. We were carefully considering the many recommendations of the advisory committee of the director. And one action that we did take back in June of 2020 is that we provided some guidance to the community about what happens if there is a change in status, including absence of the PI and other key personnel named in the notice of award. Now, that may sound very bureaucratic, so let me explain what this means. One manifestation of harassment is that a scientist is asked to leave an institution. They may be terminated, they may resign, there may be a non-disclosure agreement. We'll talk more about that later. And so then they move from one institution to another. And so as a result, we have this phenomenon of passive harasser, where a person who engages in bad behavior eventually gets to the point where the institution can't deal with it anymore. And so then they move on to someplace else. The second institution now thinks that they have recruited a superstar. And what they're particularly excited about, and I think Dr. Mahmoudi alluded to this in his intro, is the money. They're coming along with a lot of NIH funding. And so we put this in our guidance. We said, because NIH recipients are expected to provide safe and healthful working conditions for their employees and foster work environments conducive to high quality research, a request for approval. So a request for approval means that we're making some kind of a change in the structure or leadership of a grant. Should include mention as to whether changes in the principal investigator or senior key personnel is related to concerns about safety and/or work environment due to concerns about harassment, bullying, retaliation, or hostile work situations. NIH will in turn be better positioned to enable informed grant stewardship decisions. All right, so that's June of 2020, but it wasn't until 2022 that something major happened that really gave us a greater degree of leverage, and that was a law passed by Congress that came out with the 2022 appropriations bill, and this is from the law. It's Section 239. And it says that the director of the National Institutes of Health shall hereafter require institutions that receive fundings through a grant or cooperative agreement during fiscal year 2022 and in future years to notify the director when individuals identified as a principal or as key personnel in an NIH notice of award are removed from their position or are otherwise disciplined due to concerns about harassment, bullying, retaliation, or hostile working conditions. So there's several really important points about this. Number one, this is statute. This is a law. It's not policy. It's not regulation. And therefore, it carries a great deal of weight. The second is that the the uh, the 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 conditions that are identified by Congress are not necessarily linked to NIH awards. Any kind of disciplinary action that is taken for any of these wide variety of problems has to be reported to us. So, for example, we've heard about cases of people who engaged in bullying or other types of problematic behaviors in the classroom, or by virtue of the fact of their administrative positions. So not necessarily what's going on in a laboratory, but nonetheless, when there are bad behaviors occurring outside the laboratory, there may very well be bad behaviors occurring inside the laboratory. Okay, so that's 2022. 2023, this continues to be a problem, and here are two headlines that I will talk about both of these later. The case on the left was an article that appeared in Science not quite a year ago. NIH rules are supposed to stop past the harasser. In one recent case, they appear to have failed, and I'm going to talk about that. And then this is another case on the right, and this case is interesting because it illustrates a problem that we sometimes refer to as the confluence of sins, that if a person is engaged in one kind of bad behavior, they're likely to engage in other kinds of bad behavior as well. Now, a very important challenge that we face is grounded in the structure of how the government funds science. And this goes all the way back to the Vannevar Bush report from 1945 on the government-university partnership. The partnership is between the government and universities, not the government and individual scientists. And therefore, NIH, as a funding organization, does not give awards to scientists. We give awards to organizations, typically universities, academic hospitals, small businesses, independent research institutes. And this is something which is explicitly stated in our what we call our NIH grants policy statement. This is kind of like our Bible. We put this out about once a year, every year and a half or so. And what's in there constitutes terms and conditions of an award. So we make the award to a domestic organization. So we make an award to the organizations. We function as a funding steward, but the organizations in turn are responsible for their employees. They're not our employees. They are the organization's employees. And therefore, we only have a limited amount of leverage. So then what is our leverage? So one important piece of leverage is that, as is stated in our grants policy statement and now backed up by law, NIH recipients are expected to provide safe and healthful working conditions for their employees. That is a term and condition of award. And as we'll get to momentarily, it is in regulation that institutions must abide by the terms and conditions of award. Institutions have to provide assurance that they are complying with civil rights laws. And then, as I'm now going to talk about in a bit more detail, recipient organizations are expected to establish codes of conduct. And these codes of conduct include expectations of integrity and ethical values, And that means work environments that are free of discriminatory harassment and are safe and conducive to high quality work. All right, so let's talk about this a bit more. So in our grants policy statement, we say that recipient organizations have to have internal controls. And these internal controls need to be in compliance with a document, which I'm going to share with you momentarily, called Standards for Control in the Federal Government. Again, that sounds like a very bureaucratic title, but this is an extraordinarily important document, which we will look at. So recipient organizations are expected to establish codes of conduct, which define expectations of integrity and ethical value and criteria of competence of personnel involved in the work supported by NIH grants. Codes of conduct should articulate expectations to assure compliance with terms and conditions of award, including that work environments are free of discriminatory harassment and are safe and conducive to high quality work. Okay, so this is the document that is referred to, the Standards for Internal Control by the Federal Government. This was a document that was put out by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, back in 2014, 10 years ago. It is referred to as the Green Book. It is not to be confused with the Green Book in the movie. This is a little bit about what the Green Book is and how it's supposed to be used. So the Green Book describes internal controls for government agencies. The regulation, which is I alluded to before, that there's a regulation, 45 CFR 75.303, and that regulation explicitly says that recipient organizations of federal awards have to have internal controls that are in line with what is in this Green Book. So this describes in detail about, what is an internal control, how do you use it, who would use it, how do internal controls work, and so forth. So these are the principles that are described there of internal control. So oversight and management should demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. And obviously, as part of that, they should describe what integrity and ethical values means. They should establish and oversee an internal control system. And they should establish an organizational structure, assign responsibility, and delegate authority to achieve their objectives. They need to recruit, develop, and retain competent individuals. Now, I think we can argue that somebody who's managing a laboratory and is not upholding the integrity and ethical values espoused by the institution, as well as the terms and conditions of federal award, is not competent. So competent doesn't just mean that they know their science or that they're good with their hands. It also means that their behaviors are appropriate. And institutions need to evaluate performance and hold individuals accountable. This is a very long document, but these are the key principles. And there's something that they refer to as a cube. So there are components of control, which include from the top to the bottom, the environment, the assessment, various activities, information and communication, and then monitoring. There are categories of activities, operations, reporting, and compliance. And then there are levels of organizational structure, and you can then go into this in great detail according to those three axes. All right, so what do we do? So we have now handled, and I'm going to go into more detail about this in just a bit, but we have now handled over 800 harassment cases of different types since 2018. We receive allegations through any of a variety of means. Sometimes a phone call, we have a mailbox, sometimes from our own staff who inform us of problems. But by far away, it's our web form. And our web form, we can get allegations from anybody, including anonymous allegations. So a number of our allegations are anonymous. And also, our web form is where we get now the institutional disclosures that are required by Section 239 of the congressional law. And then what we do is we Sometimes we will go out, reach out to the complainant, and we will ask for additional information. We review internal grant documents. We look for whether or not there is anything in the media. Sometimes we think about consulting already at this point, other agencies. And if things look like there's a problem, we contact the institution, typically the vice president for research. And then we have a set of SOPs, which is on our website. And these interactions that we have with institutions can then lead to any of a number of outcomes. There can be institutional discipline. There can be actions involving grants, which could include removing a person from a grant as a principal investigator. There may be additional institutional safeguards or monitoring. So, for example, sometimes what we'll do is we will ask for an external climate assessment of a laboratory and then continuous monitoring that might occur on a quarterly basis for, say, a year. We have a very low threshold to remove people off of peer review study sections. Sometimes we do refer cases to the Office of the Inspector General. We also have a good working relationship with the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Health and Human Services, and they actually have access to all of our records, so they can see what's going on. And then we can also make referrals to the department for suspension and debarment. So here's our data. So on the top, we show for each calendar year, these are data through December of 2023, how many cases did we get? So you've seen we've had a dramatic increase in the number of cases, and in 2023 we had 190 cases. So we almost got one allegation every workday. Initially, most of the allegations were sexual harassment or gender discrimination, but now in more recent years, it's been the other way around. And so it's more non-sexual harassment, bullying, retaliation, discrimination, other than gender discrimination, general hostile work environment. And these constitute now most of our cases. So in 2023, it was about 2/3 of the cases were not sexual harassment or gender discrimination, but other types of things. A minority of the cases involve media publicity. An increasing number of cases now are self-disclosures. And by self-disclosures, that means that the institutions are telling us about the problem rather than our finding out about the problem in some other way. Now, one really important point here is that only a minority of cases are the allegations substantiated. Now we'll talk about that in a bit because this may be a bit of an underestimate, but I will say that I do believe that this is correct because we have seen from our own internal data at NIH very similar numbers, that about 20 to 30% of allegations of inappropriate work conduct or harassment or bullying are substantiated. Now, it's still a large number of cases that are substantiated, but it's an important point to make. So here are our outcomes, and we divide these cases up between those that involve sexual harassment, gender discrimination, that's on the left, and then those that would involve other problems, non-sexual harassment, bullying, retaliation, hostile work environment on the right. We contact institutions about 80% of the time. Why don't we contact institutions 100% of the time? Because sometimes what we get is just so vague that there's nothing that we or anyone can do with it. There are most of the cases for sexual harassment, gender discrimination lead to a formal investigation, about half for others. Not surprisingly, the respondent is male more often in cases of sexual harassment or gender discrimination. About 1/3 of the sexual harassment or gender discrimination cases, the allegations are substantiated. It's about 20% of the others. We do have cases where the principal investigator is removed or where institutional safeguards are put into place. About 1/4 of the sexual harassment and gender discrimination cases are associated with the PI leaving an institution, less so with the other cases. And then, like I said, we have a very low threshold of removing people from peer review. Okay, here what we do is we split up the data according to whether or not the respondent is male or female. Again, male respondents are more likely um, to um, to be cited for sexual harassment or gender discrimination. They're more likely to have any of a variety of outcomes. So it's more likely with a male respondent that the allegation will be substantiated, that they'll be removed from a grant, that institutional safeguards will be put into place, that they will leave an institution. All right. So it's important to point out allegations may or may not be substantiated. Now, the case on the left is a kind of amazing case where initially the allegation, and by the way, what I'm saying now is public. I'm not breaking any confidences here. So, what I'm telling you is what's in this news article. Initially, this particular individual it was found that he had not violated policy. And then, to make a very long story short, there was a follow-up investigation in which it was determined that he had violated policy. But not only that, he had also fabricated evidence. Now, this is important because we do see this phenomenon of confluence of sins. And I noticed that Dr. Mahmoudi talked about research integrity. These do sometimes go together, that if somebody engaged in one kind of bad behavior, they'll engage in others. And then, on the right, we have a situation where there was a prominent complainant, and then it turned out that this prominent complainant they were themselves engaged in some problematic behavior, and they had fabricated information. So the point here is that these cases can be quite messy, complicated, and it's often not straightforward. The allegations may or may not be correct. Now, we had this case that got a lot of publicity about stopping passing the harasser. This is the phenomenon where somebody is in an institution, they get into trouble, they resign, retire from the institution, they may even be terminated, and then they go someplace else. And the second institution either has no idea what's going on, maybe they have some idea what's going on, but they go ahead and they hire this person, and they think that they have recruited a superstar. Now, in this particular case, and again, I will only share what's public, but in this particular case, the harassment investigation and findings occurred in April of 2020. The law that was passed to stop passing the law that was instituted to stop passing the harasser, as I mentioned, was passed in 2022. This case actually very nicely illustrates why the rules are necessary, because the events took place before the rules came into play. I think it's fair to say that had those rules been in place back in April of 2020, when this case actually happened, there would have been a different outcome. Now, we're very pleased to see that various organizations are aware of this problem. AAU put out a statement of principles in 2021 about sharing substantiated findings of sexual misconduct with prospective employers, and also completing investigations, notwithstanding the departure of the respondent from the institution. Very often, and I think this is much more common than not, an institution will cease a professional misconduct investigation if employment ends. The whole process just comes to a screeching halt. So there may be no finding when in fact there would have been a finding. And so that's why I think that despite the fact that most of the allegations are not substantiated, the numbers that we have may be a bit of an underestimate, because we have some of these cases where people leave and technically there is no finding, although there would have been. There's been a lot of interest in non-disclosure agreements. So, non-disclosure agreement is where, a legal deal is made between a respondent and their employer, where they'll basically say nobody's going to say anything about anything to anybody, and in exchange for that, the person will leave. Congress did pass a law in late 2022 to address this. It hasn't become clear to us that there's anything in this law that directly affects the funding agencies. Um, and uh, but I will say this, which is that NIH as an organization, we used to do this too, and we used to have non-disclosure agreements, and we don't do that anymore. So for our own harassment cases, and we've had some bad harassment cases, we will no longer agree to non-disclosure as part of a person's separation from the agency. All right, here's another challenge that we have, and that is that we will hear back from the university that will say that there were findings of violations of policy, and so as a result, they're not going to be allowed to supervise. They can't supervise graduate students. They can't supervise postdocs. They can't supervise junior personnel. But don't worry, NIH, everything's fine. There's going to be no impact on NIH-funded research, and this sometimes leads to some rather difficult conversations. All right, so here's some other challenges. We've had cases that are not linked to NIH-funded activities or organizations. There's only so far we can go. We're not a law enforcement agency. We're not a regulatory agency. We're not an investigatory agency. We are an agency that's concerned about grants compliance, and that's where we do have some authorities, which we do leverage. But if there is no clear, not even the beginning of a link to NIH-funded activities or organizations, there's not much we can really do. As I mentioned, they're not our employees. They're the employees of the institutions, and so that does limit how much we can do. Many of the cases that we are dealing with are classic employer-employee disputes. There's an employee who may have a performance issue. The employer attempts to hold them accountable. There have been no complaints whatsoever about harassment or bullying or anything. And then once a penalty is imposed, then we hear about it, and there's an accusation of harassment. We've had cases of people who didn't get promoted. Let's say they didn't get tenure. They may not have gotten tenure because they didn't publish any papers. And then, we got a complaint about possible harassment. So a number of the cases are not really harassment or bullying, but they're more, typical kinds of disputes between employers and employees. Another problem is where the complainant becomes the respondent. So this is where things get really messy. So as an example, we had a case, well, we've had more than one case. We've had cases where it was the complainant who was actually bullying the respondent and not the other way around. We have had cases where judges have imposed restraining orders on complainants because they were harassing respondents and their families. Some of these investigations are very long and complicated. Some of the allegations that we get are non-specific. There's not much we can do with it. And then we have a very heavy caseload. We're getting, like I said, we're getting about 180 to 190 cases a year. All right, what lessons have we learned? So one is that it is helpful for us to get source data. And so sometimes what we do is we ask for copies of investigation reports or executive summaries of investigation reports. And these can sometimes be enormously helpful to help us understand some of the variety of work environment issues. Another is tenacity. We will often not accept the first answer that we get. There is a value of third-party reporting. So our web form that allows anybody to report and allows anybody to report even anonymously enables us to find out a lot of things and to engage in dialogue with institutions where we otherwise would not do. Because we have seen over 800 cases, we can now share experiences, not by name, but we can say, well, some institutions that we see that handle these kinds of problems quite well, do X, Y, and Z. So you might want to consider doing that. And one excellent practice are third-party assessments, where institutions bring in outside firms, auditing firms, law firms, that know how to do this kind of thing and do high quality third party assessments. There are institutions that have a culture of self-disclosure and accountability. There are certain institutions that the first we'll hear of problems is their leadership will contact us. They will say, here's what's going on, and this is what we're planning to do. And then another point, and Dr. Mahmoudi alluded to this also in his introduction, is about the communication of results to the results of investigations to complainants. Now, we understand there are laws. There are HR laws, employment laws, there's the privacy acts. There are differences between what state institutions can do and private institutions can do. There are labor unions and employment contracts. So there's a lot of issues, and so some institutions are able to communicate the results of investigations to all interested parties, including complainants, but others cannot. All right, so in conclusion, I want to thank you again for inviting me to be here. We have developed a large caseload, and we're gaining more experience in this area. More of our cases are not sexual harassment or gender discrimination, but rather involve bullying, retaliation, adverse work environment. We do see a greater degree of institutional awareness and engagement. Part of this may be due to to our activities. Part of it may be due to Section 239 with the required reporting. I do know of a number of institutions around the country that have actually made this part of their top line strategic plan, and have put a fair amount of resources into improving the quality of their work environment. And we have a number of continued challenges, including disrupted investigations, non-disclosure agreements, extraordinarily complex cases, and ultimately, and I think this is something that was also very nicely alluded to in Dr. Mahmoudi's introduction, is the need for cultural change. So thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting, and turn this back to you.